So, last time we talked about starting and why most people quit early.
Yeah, the excitement phase versus the reality phase.
Exactly. And I feel like this is where discipline comes in.
It does, but not in the way people think.
What do you mean?
People think discipline is about being intense, strict, almost aggressive with yourself.
Like forcing yourself no matter what.
Yeah, but real discipline is actually much calmer than that.
Calmer?
It's more about stability than intensity. It's quiet, consistent decisions, not dramatic effort.
That's not how it's usually presented.
Because calm consistency doesn't look impressive, but it works.
So, discipline isn't about going all in?
Not at all. Going all in is usually what leads to burnout.
That makes sense. People start strong, then disappear.
Exactly. Discipline is about showing up even when it's not exciting, and especially when no one is watching.
That part is hard when there's no external validation.
Yeah, because then it's just you and your choices.
No applause, no likes, no recognition.
Just progress, or lack of it.
So, how do you build that kind of discipline?
You don't start with discipline.
That sounds backwards.
You start with habits.
Okay, explain that.
Discipline is like a muscle. It's limited. You can't rely on it for everything. Habits, on the other hand, run automatically.
So, habits reduce the need for discipline.
Exactly. The goal is to need less willpower, not more.
That's interesting. Most people try to become more disciplined instead of more structured.
Yes, and that's why they struggle. They're fighting themselves every day instead of designing systems that support them.
So, what's a habit really?
A repeated behavior that becomes automatic over time.
Sounds simple.
It is simple, but building it requires patience.
There's that word again.
It always comes back to patience.
So, how long does it take to build a habit?
Longer than people expect.
Of course.
It's not about a fixed number of days. It depends on consistency, environment, and how simple the habit is.
So, doing something every day matters more than doing it perfectly.
Always.
Let's talk about starting habits. Why do people fail at that stage?
Because they start with motivation instead of structure.
Meaning?
They rely on how they feel instead of creating a clear system.
So, when motivation drops, the habit disappears.
Exactly.
What would a better approach look like?
You make the habit obvious, easy, and specific.
Give me an example.
Instead of saying, I'll work out more, you say, I'll do 10 minutes of exercise at 7 p.m. in my room.
That's very specific.
Specific removes decision making, and the less you have to think, the more likely you are to act.
That's true. Thinking can be a barrier sometimes.
A big one, especially when you're tired or stressed.
So, habits should be simple and clear.
Yes, and small.
Again with the small.
Always small.
Why is small so important?
Because small removes resistance.
Resistance.
That internal friction you feel when something seems too hard or overwhelming.
Like when you think, I'll do it later.
Exactly. That's resistance talking.
So if something feels too easy to avoid, you're more likely to do it.
Yes, and once you start, it's easier to continue.
So starting is the real challenge.
Always. Starting is everything.
Let's shift to identity. This is something people talk about, but I don't think everyone really understands it.
Yeah, identity is deeper than habits. It's about how you see yourself.
And that affects what you do.
Completely. Your actions tend to align with your identity.
So if I see myself as someone who is lazy,
You'll act in ways that confirm that belief.
even if I don't want to,
Yes, because the brain likes consistency between belief and behavior.
that's kind of frustrating.
It is, but it also works in your favor if you change the identity.
How do you do that?
Not by saying, I'm a different person, and hoping it sticks.
So affirmations alone don't work.
Without evidence, your brain needs proof.
So how do you give it proof?
Through small actions.
Back to habits again.
Exactly. Every time you act in a certain way, you reinforce that identity.
So if I want to become a disciplined person,
You act like one in small ways consistently.
even if I don't feel like one yet.
Especially then.
So identity follows behavior.
Yes, not the other way around.
That's a big shift.
It changes everything because you stop waiting to become someone before acting.
You act first, then become.
Exactly.
Let's make this practical again. Say someone wants to build a reading habit.
Okay.
What would be the wrong way to do it?
I'll read 50 pages every day starting tomorrow.
That sounds ambitious.
It is, and that's the problem.
So what's the right way?
I'll read 1 page every night before bed.
1 page?
Yes,
That feels almost too easy.
that's the point. You remove all excuses.
And once you start, you might read more.
Exactly. But even if you don't, you still win.
Because you showed up.
Yes, and showing up consistently is what builds identity.
That's powerful.
It is. Over time, you stop saying, I'm trying to read more, and start saying, I'm someone who reads.
That's the shift.
That's the shift.
Let's talk about breaking bad habits. That's just as important.
Definitely. And it's often harder.
Why harder?
Because bad habits are usually tied to comfort or relief.
Like scrolling, junk food, procrastination.
Exactly. They give you immediate reward.
While good habits give delayed reward.
Yes, and the brain prefers immediate reward.
So how do you break a bad habit?
You don't just remove it, you replace it.
Replace it with what?
Something that gives a similar benefit but in a healthier way.
Can you give an example?
If you scroll your phone to relax, maybe you replace it with listening to music or taking a short walk.
So you keep the relief part but change the behavior.
Exactly.
That sounds more realistic than just quitting.
Because quitting without replacing creates a gap, and that gap usually gets filled with the same habit again.
Makes sense.
Also, you make bad habits harder to do.
Like removing triggers?
Yes, if your phone distracts you, put it in another room.
Simple, but effective.
Most effective strategies are simple
People just overlook them.
because they're not dramatic.
Everyone wants a big solution.
The real change is built on small adjustments.
Let's talk about consistency again because everything seems to come back to it.
It really does.
Why is consistency so hard?
Because people rely on feelings.
So when they don't feel like it, they stop.
Exactly.
How do you stay consistent when you don't feel like it?
You lower the bar, but you don't skip.
That's interesting.
If you can't do your full routine, do a smaller version.
So instead of skipping a workout, you do 5 minutes.
Yes, you protect the habit.
That's a powerful idea.
Because once you start skipping, it becomes easier to skip again.
So consistency is more important than intensity.
Always.
Let's talk about something uncomfortable. Excuses.
Yeah, we all have them.
And they always sound reasonable.
That's the problem. If they sounded ridiculous, we wouldn't believe them.
So how do you deal with excuses?
You don't argue with them too much. You just act anyway.
That sounds simple, but hard.
It is, but over time, you realize most excuses are patterns.
Patterns.
Same thoughts, different day.
That's true.
Once you recognize them, they lose power.
So awareness is key.
Always.
Let's go deeper into identity for a moment. What happens when someone has a negative self-image?
It affects everything, their choices, their confidence, their consistency.
So even if they try to improve, something holds them back.
Yes, because deep down, they don't believe they're the kind of person who can succeed.
That's heavy.
It is, but it can change
How?
by collecting small wins.
Again, small.
Always small.
Why are small wins so powerful?
Because they're believable. Your brain accepts them as proof.
So instead of trying to convince yourself with big statements,
You show yourself with small actions.
that feels more real.
It is.
So over time, your identity shifts naturally
Yes, and once your identity shifts, your behavior becomes easier.
because it aligns with who you are.
Exactly.
That's a full circle.
It is.
So if we had to summarize this part,
Discipline isn't about intensity, it's about consistency.
habits reduce the need for discipline,
And identity is built through repeated action,
not through thinking or wishing,
through doing,
even when it's small.
especially when it's small.
That seems to be the theme.
It always is.
This was powerful.
Yeah, this is where things start to become real.
Less theory, more practice.
Exactly.
All right. Next time, I want to talk about mindset,
Oh, that's going to be a deep one.
overthinking, confidence, all of that.
Yeah, that's where a lot of people get stuck.
Then we'll go there next.
Sounds good.
If you're listening, don't try to change everything today
Just build one small habit.
and repeat it.
That's how it starts.